Hey Finn, welcome. Happy to see another history special. Oh yes, it's been quite a while, but I would want to make one each month now, so we'll see how that goes. There are certainly enough things to cover, it's just if it's gonna be practical. Okay, so let's shut over the browser source. So today we'll be covering Hussite Wars, which is a period in history of Bohemian lands especially, but it also is relevant to Hungarians as well as the Austrians and Germans, and in general just general European history, because the Hussite ideology is basically what Protestant Christians preached later, while you had the 30 Years' War and Martin Luther and other various preachers like him who wanted to reform the Catholic Church's approach. And basically all the thoughts that these people had came more or less from either John Wycliffe, which was an early English author and a philosopher on Reformation topics, and Jan Hus, who was a Czech preacher who inspired himself and corresponded with John Wycliffe. And so this happened roughly 100 years before all the other major reformators came into being. And so Hussites in a way were the first people who really thought about reforming the Catholic Church in terms of its approach towards absolutions and all the various other things that bothered later reformators. And so since it happened early, it wasn't received well, especially Germans cracked down upon it and wanted to extinguish the rebellion quite quickly. It was a widespread uprising though, it was not just a peasant revolt you would have in various other places in Europe because of one reason or the other. Quite the contrary, actually. In Czech lands, the Hussite uprising was composed of a lot of noblemen. Majority of them were from Bohemia. Well, we can take a look now at the map of Czech lands at the time, which was the start of Hussite Wars is dated at 1419, and so this is the how the lands look like, the borders. So the red border is the core Czech lands, Bohemia, and then you've got a duchy of Grand Duchy of Moravia, which is the green border, which is adjacent to Czech Bohemian territory. Then you've got Silesia, which is also part of Czech crown lands, and so that's the orange border that goes around it. During the Hussite uprising, the Bohemian lands were mostly Hussite. When the crusade was called, most people in Bohemia, be it nobles or commoners, joined the Hussites or were not opposed to them. There were some cases where some people attempted to hold out or join the Catholics, but due to the overwhelming presence of Hussite ideology everywhere, it didn't really go very well for them. We will talk about that in a little bit here. But mainly in Moravia, the people were split roughly equally between Catholics and Hussites, which resulted in a lot of fighting, and it was basically a focus of some of the later campaigns of the Crusades against Hussites, because they wanted to solidify their position in Moravia and turn it towards Catholicism, and so that they have basically a launching pad for their invasion of Bohemia proper. Key figure of the Catholic armies and crusades was a Hungarian king, Sigismund of Hungary, which was a brother of Czech king at the time, which Czech king at the time was called Wenceslaus IV, and he was of Přemysl dynasty, which was one of the greatest dynasties of Bohemian rulers. And his predecessor, Charles IV, is known as the father of the fatherland here, basically, because he is known as the greatest ruler we had. He managed to work with very little, but managed to achieve big advancements. He founded universities and made huge construction projects, as well as consolidated his authority and rule in Bohemia, which led to increased stability and prosperity of his subjects. Wenceslas IV, however, was not, even though he was by his father raised for that purpose as being a future monarch, he did not really take to ruling willingly. He much rather would just spend his time hunting and feasting rather than actually taking care of his subjects, and that led to some instability. Namely, if you are familiar with Kingdom Come Deliverance, that covers the early part of his reign fairly well, and this Hussite Wars happened afterwards. So Kingdom Come is like 1404, something like that, while Hussite Wars start at 1419 in terms of violent uprising. So it's that sort of gives you a little bit of an insight of, if you are familiar with KCD, of how some of these people might still be around that you might encounter as characters in KCD. One of the examples is, for example, Lord Capon, which in KCD is known as a young lord who's supposed to inherit some estates, and during Hussite Wars he actually did join the Catholics, and he did so unwillingly, and so his contributions to their cause were not any spectacular thing. He besieged the castle, but he intentionally drew it out, and he didn't even block off the besieged enemy's water supply. For example, he let them just collect water from the creek, even though they were Hussites, so he was supposed to take care of them. But that's just a tangent, that's not important for what we are here for. Now, I need to show you Sigismund. This is the king, Wenceslas IV. So this is some illustration of how he might have looked like. This is him in with his crown and royal regalia. And you can see Bohemian coat of arms for the Kingdom of Bohemia here, which was his main title. He was also supposed to be Roman Emperor, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, because his father, Charles IV, was Holy Roman Emperor as well, and he actually did a reasonable job at it, as he was just a freaking genius at his job. He was a very, very competent monarch. But as I said, Wenceslas was not exactly great. He also was quite stressed by all the responsibilities that came with ruling, and he didn't take up to it naturally, and so he had quite a few complications, ranging from uprisings to weak authority of the crown, because nobles managed to basically strong arm him into agreeing to various sorts of things that he wasn't really comfortable with, because it reduced the crown authority if the nobles managed to get their way with various things, be it taxes or other liberties. And so he faced difficult position, but during his later life, when this is the part where Hussite uprising happened, he was actually trying to consolidate his power more so that he can more effectively rule, but unfortunately he was already known as a weak king to various subjects, and so it came a little bit too late. And okay, so that's the general overview. I'll let you take a look at the map again, and we are gonna take a look at the main figure that was behind the Hussite uprising, and what happened with this chief person was he was inspired by John Wycliffe. As I mentioned, that was an English philosopher and writer who criticized Catholic Church for its corrupt systems and absolutions and various things like that. And so one of the people in Bohemia at the time was a preacher who was called Jan Hus, and this person, I'm gonna take a look at his that's an illustration how he might have looked like. So we have, oh yeah, there is Sigismund of Hungary, which we talked about before. He was king of Hungary at the time, so he was brother of Wenceslas IV. There we go. So this is supposed to be Jan Hus. That's the preacher of Hussite ideology, basically founder of it, because Hussites call themselves Hussites according to his surname, which was Hus. And he was called Hus because he came from a township of Husinets. And so in medieval period, people didn't really have surnames for the most part. You more or less had people had surnames as either their profession, so you would be a miller or a blacksmith or whatever, you would have some sort of surname that's adjacent to that profession. Or you would be called, if you lived somewhere else, like Henry Hus lived in Prague, he would be called Hus because he was from Husinec. Not many people were from Husinec, and so it fitted, and it was not a very common surname, and so he was called that. And so this person, Jan Hus, he was a preacher, and therefore a monk, or a priest rather, and he was also a lector at the Prague University, which was founded by Charles IV. And from 1402, he started to preach in Prague's churches and chapels. He was inspired by the English philosopher John Wycliffe, who wrote many works on Reformation ideas. And Jan Hus was mainly focused on preaching about moral decline of the Catholic Church, which attracted crowds of followers. Not only crowds of followers in terms of common people, but a lot of nobles also liked this ideology, and they liked reducing the power of church and king in terms of them having more power themselves. So some of it might have been inspired by just power grab, while some of it might have been innocuous religious fervor. But who can really say how many of them followed either of these paths? Hey Frankie, welcome. Can you read the text? It's German. No. It's just an illustration of him, but at the time a lot of stuff was in German here, and so it's probably why it is like that. But if you want, I can maybe zoom it if you want to read what's there. You can do that. Okay, where were we? Yeah, so he mainly focused on preaching about moral decline of Catholic Church, which attracted crowds of followers. Mainly he wanted the Church to get rid of many of its worldly possessions and dedicate their lives to serving God and people. He was also heavily opposed to the Church selling absolution and getting rich from people committing foul deeds and later absolving themselves of all guilt by paying them money, and they were getting insanely rich off of this, because even nobles could afford this. And so if there was, for example, an argument between two noble houses, what could happen is there could even be a duel or a murder, and then the person guilty would just go and pay money to the church, and he would be absolutely free of any guilt and persecution. On top of this, the main motivating factor for common people was that bishops, and especially bishops, but all the religious figureheads, especially in big cities like Prague, in Bohemia, used their wealth towards funding various things, not only art and things like that, but also just plain debauchery. And even the bishops even held courtesans. They had palaces, they had their own stables, they kept expensive horses, they bought various expensive silks and other things to make garments from, which was just blatant, how do you call that? I mean, it's not embezzlement, but they were wasting money that they made off of people, because they also collected taxes from people's income, and that all went towards these various things. If it went towards education or funding construction projects or upkeeping church property, that would generally be received fine. But due to the corruption and debauchery of these figureheads, it constantly rose resentment in the local populace against the clergy. And so that was one of the key things that motivated people to follow Hussite ideology and preachings, because they didn't like this. And so, as I said, some nobles might have had some motivations in terms of getting more powerful and reducing power of king and clergy. but some of them did follow it innocuously because of religious zeal. And so you have sort of a combination of these things, which later on will become apparent, where there's going to be minor and major shift in Hussite ideology, and you will have people who are radicals and you will have people who are conservatives, and it's sort of developed. But this is the period of the initial preachings where this was not outlawed yet. It was just seen as a regular Catholic priest and Catholic preacher. It attracted crowds of followers. He preached in Prague's churches and chapels, even in the Bethlehem chapel, which is a big, copiously decorated one, which had huge amounts of people in it. Huge crowds of people came to see these preachings. Some of them couldn't even fit into these structures, and so a lot of it was also delegated through people's voices, like people talk to each other about the preaching, since not everyone could make it. And so this ideology spread throughout Bohemia and reached even the remote rural areas, not just the cities, which people also did take pilgrimages to cities to actually see the preachings themselves. Various other preachers also followed the Hussite ideology and started to preach in similar way to Hus, but Hus was the major figurehead and basically the founder of the movement. Therefore, we are mainly talking about him in this context. Another key point he made was the necessity of preaching in native language. So at this point, the Bible was not translated to Czech, but it was not common for people to even receive their service at Sundays in Czech, and so they would have to listen to Latin. Not everybody could speak Latin. Most people would at least understand the rudimentary words and sentences in Latin, but it was a huge deal, especially for the common people, to be able to have their sermons in Czech, because that's what would feel natural to them, and it felt to them like they were being ostracized from the process of communion and everything else, that being just not understandable by them if it was in Latin. Hey Liger, welcome. And so that was also one of his major points, and people did like this as well. His other chief idea was that both common people and clergy were supposed to receive both bread and wine as a communion. Sounds like even more boring to listen to something totally not understand. Yeah, basically, like if you wanted people to actually pay attention to a lot of the stuff that was told in these sermons, you would usually have to how to call it? Like you would have to make up some additional flair to make it interesting, and so Hus made it because he was very popular as a preacher. Like he was a popular figurehead at the time. You can, like today, it would be something not like as a comedian, but you would have it like a very good public speaker and basically almost a politician. You would be following this guy and liking his ideals, and so he didn't add too much humor to the sermons, but you would have a lot of complaints and religious zeal building up in people in terms of like what is all these things that people disagree with and what could be changed in terms of how the church was run. Of course, you can imagine that since this happened 100 years before most other Protestants became a thing, this was not well received by papacy or neighbors of Bohemian lands for that matter. And so even the king didn't like this because it fundamentally eroded the idea of separating power and that clergy ran itself, and so that would by proxy erode power of the king as well. Since he was not doing anything about this, people saw him as even more weak, and so that led to people being more and more agitated even towards the king's power and authority. His other chief idea was that both common people and clergy were supposed to receive both bread and wine as a communion. So this was a practice where even today, if you are a Christian, you go to a sermon, you will be receiving Holy Communion, which is that you will receive bread and wine as blood and body of Christ, and that was a symbolism which John Wycliffe actually wrote a thesis on how it was not a transmutation of these things that you were given into actual blood and flesh. So it was not like cannibalism, which some people in the clergy at the time believed that it was a literal transmutation of things, and you were eating the flesh of Christ. And so this was another disagreement. It sounds ridiculous, but yeah, it sounds like heresy because he wanted people to receive both bread and wine during the communion, which church disagreed with, and they didn't want to do it. And so this was another major shift, which common people were also impressed by this idea and wanted it. These ideas were looked upon by the Catholic Church as heretical, and in 1411 he was declared a heretic and was excommunicated. Hus continued to preach, and only after the king and Archbishop of Prague ordered it, he went into seclusion into a castle near modern-day Tábor city in Czechia. So, I guess we bring up the map again. So, when that happened, you can see in the Bohemia there is the big purple circle there. That's where Prague is. It's nice and central. It was a capital city, quite big for the time, and so common people through heresy. Yeah. And so he was forced to abandon his practice of preaching and had to go into seclusion, which happened near the city, in a small castle near the city of Tábor, which is right here. It is the second smaller purple circle in the South Bohemia, where he still preached to some people who came to see him, but it was not anything like the mass preachings he had. I'm gonna show you a painting of one of these preachings and how it might have looked like. So you can see some of the religious structures he used for those preachings were quite expansive and accommodated a huge amount of people on multiple stories and levels. So you had even like thousands of people witnessing this, and then it spread like wildfire throughout Bohemian lands. As I said, peasants and nobles alike liked this ideology, and so it was a brewing problem because they didn't necessarily view themselves as heretics, but to regular Catholics who didn't want to reduce the authority of the church, this sounded more and more like it's gonna become a huge problem, but nobody was doing anything about it. The king saw this as a problem, but all the attempts he made to fix this problem were inadequate and even misguided, because he tried to use force to make people abandon this way of thinking, and so as you can imagine, that really didn't go too well. So let's get to another part. So in 1414, Sigismund of Hungary called a council of Kosnice, where it was supposed to end the papal schism and resolve key issues across Christendom. So just so we know, there was a papal schism, which is a situation where not only you had a pope in Rome, but you also had anti-pope in Avignon, in the Holy Roman Empire, and then you also had a third freaking pope at this point, because another one was declared, and so you had three popes. And so this council was called by King Sigismund of Hungary, which was brother of Czech king, and it was supposed to resolve this key issue that was splitting Christendom, and also resolve other issues, namely the Hussite question, because it was acknowledged that it needs to be resolved, and they promised they would look into ideas that Hus and Hussites brought up in this council. And so, straight into it. Hus was also summoned to this meeting to advocate for his alleged heresy. After arrival, he was however quickly arrested and sentenced to death as a heretic. It was actually not that quick. There were trials. He spoke at length about his ideals and what did he learn from Wycliffe, which Wycliffe was also at this point accused of heresy, but by his own local authority he was nowhere near Bohemia, so it's not that important. But suffice to say, they didn't really let him get away with any of those thoughts, and so he was sentenced to death as a heretic. And they did commit this on 6th of July 1415. They burned him at a stake at the Kosnice place where the council was supposed to be held. And so after this happened, the message spread quickly back in Bohemia that Jan Hus has been executed as a heretic. When did the Catholic Church ever had not a heresy or a schism? Adrians, Cathars, Hussites, Lutherans, Calvinists, and never-ending story. Yeah, basically. But Hussites were one of the earlier, bigger, how would you call it, reformers, and so that's why they are interesting. And more interesting factor of them is the wars, because they were quite successful at warfare, which was not common. Like, if you had a regular peasant revolt, it wouldn't really take that long until it was inevitably crushed, and just regular peasants usually wouldn't be able to really even enforce any sort of demands unless they were led by nobility. And that's why Hussites were different, because, as I said, they had nobles amongst them, and quite a few of them, in fact. So let's read up on it some more. Back in Bohemia, the news of his death were not received well by commoners and nobles alike, and 452 Bohemian nobles sent their seals along with a letter of complaint about the trial and death of Hus. Prague University also declared that Hus was innocent and righteous. In Bohemian land, Hus was revered as a saint, and this led to a general uprising of his followers who called themselves the Hussites. As a coat of arms, they had taken the chalice of communion. I can probably show you what I mean by that. So, can you see that? You can probably see that. Make it smaller. So this is how it looked like on the flags themselves, and so you have the chalice and then a red background, because red was the traditional color of Bohemia. So that's why they came up with this. Okay, so where did we left off? As a coat of arms, they had taken the chalice of communion. In this time period, the current Bohemian king Wenceslas IV was considered a weak ruler, and this didn't improve the situation as more people became radicalized. So the trouble was brewing, as I said. Now people were even considering violent action, and they really didn't like what happened to Hus, as they wished for their ideals to be embraced or at least discussed rather than just bashed away. And they were declared heretics. So this was a major issue for these people. In Prague, a new leader of the Hussite faction was named. He was Jan Želivský, who was also a preacher. The king tried desperately to suppress the movement and appointed new aldermen for this effect. So these were the council members of the city council in Prague, and they had power over dealings in common life in Prague. And so they were appointed by the king solely for the reason of suppressing and dealing with the Hussite faction and movement. And so they took to themselves to arrest people who were leaders and preachers of this movement, which further antagonized the regular followers. On 30th of July 1419, Želivský led a mob of supporters to the Prague town hall, where the mob stormed the building and threw all the aldermen out of the windows onto the street below, where they were beaten to death by the mob. So let's take a look. We have some painting of that. I just need to find it. Here's some painting. Even today you can find all these buildings, like Old Town Hall is still standing in Prague today. It's a historical site, and so you can find these. And so the mob stormed the building, they killed various guards, it was an armed mob, they had axes, polearms, all sorts of weapons. And so they stormed the building, they found the council members, and they defenestrated them. They threw them out of the windows onto the pavement below, which, if they survived the fall, which it's not explicitly noted if they did, but it's said that some of them were also beaten to death. So those who survived probably were beaten to death afterwards. So that's what happened. Let's take a look to my notes. According to witnesses, the impoverished noble Jan Žižka was part of the assault. Žižka was in his early life a poor nobleman who joined a band of bandits and mercenaries. At this time, he was, however, pardoned and part of King's Guard. So this character, Jan Žižka, is gonna become quite important a bit later. So I'm gonna show you how he might have looked like. He lost an eye at one point in his life. He was a military guy. Basically, this dude played his life like Battle Brothers. He was a noble, but not a rich one. And so what he did is, during his early life, he had some military experience and training, and he joined with a band of mercenaries and bandits. And why he did this is he had personal issues with one of the noble houses in Bohemia, which was Rosenbergs, and also with one of the king's cities. And so he declared himself an enemy of this noble house and this city. And with this band of mercenaries, even though he was not at first their leader, he worked towards ambushing their traders and merchants, even like regular people who were from the city, and he would just find them. He would attack them on the road, and even like armed people he would fight. If they sent a unit to deal with them and fight them, which they did, then there was a lot of fighting in terms of like guerrilla style warfare, where you had groups of anything like 10, 20, up to 50 men maybe, and these sorts of groups would fight each other in the forests and mountains and general rural areas of Bohemia. And so Žižka was becoming quite skilled in terms of small unit management and using rough terrain, as well as just general small unit tactics, guerrilla warfare during medieval period basically. During this time, crossbows were wildly popular, and also gunpowder was already in Europe, and Hussites were one of the early users of gunpowder, and they were very fond of it. One of, actually, like, insanely more than any other army at the time. And so they had several different firearms they used. We'll take a look at them. And you need to keep in mind, it's makeshift firearms. Like, it's not reliable as you would have guns from like First World War or even like muskets. It's not like that. It's hand cannons, several kinds. And so they were distinguished by different bores. And so you had smaller or larger ones, and then also cannon, which was called Hofnice, which Hof is a group of people. So it was called Hofnice, which is anti-group weapon, basically. That's what a literal translation could mean. And they used, I can show you a picture of that. Oh yeah, this is the picture of a Hussite with a Pavis shield and a hand cannon. And so this is how the firearm would look like. It had quite a big shaft, and then the barrel itself was quite short. It was not rifled, like this period rifling was not a thing remotely. And so its range was severely reduced compared to some of the later period firearms, but still at a short range was effective against armor. And they loved to use these because their main enemy of the Hussites would be armored knights, and generally man-at-arms, people with very good gear and plate armor. And so they had to use anti-armor weapons most of the time, because that's how they fought. They also didn't, even though they won a whole bunch of battles, they didn't necessarily use plate armor themselves. Hussites, even though they had the option to scavenge it from the battlefield, and that was because they favored fighting in rough conditions, be it mud or forests, anything like that, and having light armor worked very well for their tactics they were using. I'm gonna explain what the tactics were and how they looked and worked like a bit later. But they needed to have that mobility factor, which kinda is similar if you think about, what I need to talk about first, I guess, is this period, so 14th, early 15th century. What was warfare like in medieval Europe? And what was it like was armies already had, there was a 100 years war going on in France, and English were fighting the French. And what happened mostly with this kind of shield, that's why I'm gonna explain it. The counterattack was all about mobility. But if Žižka was main commander, and he was the most known Hussite, but what his mind came up with was a strategy of defensive warfare was superior to offensive warfare in all circumstances, and so he brought fortifications with him to the field in terms of Wagenburg tactics, which is Wagenburg is a wall of wagons which were modified into combat wagons, not just the regular peasant wagon. But how it would look like is they would establish a line of these wagons in a formation, and then you would have pavise shields that would be in the middle of these, like when you had gaps. I can show you a picture I made. It's a rudimentary one, but it serves its purpose just to show you how that might look like. So just give me a sec. Actually, I have another one I can show you. This one is fairly okay. So they would form something like this. I can make it a bit closer so that you can see it better. And the mobility factor comes into play in terms of counterattacking, because you have these wagons. This is not an accurate representation, but it goes to show some of the features of the Wagenburg. And so you have wagons that are put side by side, but then you have in the middle, between the wagons, you would have a guy standing with the big pavise shield and a melee weapon, and you would have teams of people in each of these intersections, and you would have cannon as well that would be brought to these places. And they only had limited amount of these cannon, and so they would identify enemy positions where they come from. Like if they spotted an enemy there, they would relocate their cannon and bristle this up with cannon, while this would be left without cannons. And so they would relocate them according to their need. When the enemy would advance and attack the Wagenburg, then they would usually pull the cannon back. They would defend with pavise in these intersections, and then you would have counterattacks launched by the Hussites from these sally-ports, and lightly armored people using pole arms would rush onto the flanks and rear of the attacking army, routing them usually. So that's what would be happening. The Hussites were using several kinds of wagons, and I'm gonna show you specifically what the differences between them were. I guess now is the best time to talk about the warfare element before we really delve into the battles, because you need to understand how that might have looked like before we really do. I'm gonna show you the Hofnitze as well. I have it somewhere. I just need to find it. Yeah, you have an example of the wagon. You can see there is a sally port in the back of it, so that you can have easy loading and unloading of troops. And you've got people with crossbows as well as hand cannons fighting through the arrow slits or the embrasures. And you also had, I'm gonna explain at length how the wagon was designed, but you can see that this part is actually a separate plank of thick wood that would be added on one side of the wagon that was supposed to be facing the outside, and so it acted like armor basically against any sort of projectile weapons or even like swings of weapons overhead, and so they were quite safe in there. You had also stone and ammunition stockpile right here, and they would throw these stones to scare horses if they get too close. And they also had a team of troops that were in the wagon assigned to it basically, and you had usually a couple of people with firearms, a couple of people with flails and two-handed weapons in general, and then you had the pavise guys that were on the side of each wagon. Was custom-made wagon or adopted farmer's wagon? Usually they just confiscated a wagon, and then they just, you know, they had people like carpenters and blacksmiths with them because it was a general uprising, so basically the whole society was with Hussites at that point in terms of Bohemian society at the time, and so they just customly made them, and they had some time on their hands, and so it was custom made. It was repurposed, but in terms of its functionality, it was nothing like a wagon anymore. The wheels were armored, the sides were thickened, there was the added protection layer of that additional plate. Arrow slits were cut into the embrasures. You had an additional plank that was underneath to block any sort of possibility for enemies to crawl beneath the wagon. You had additional arrow slits in that plank so that you could have people laying in the prone position firing through that arrow slit as well underneath the wagon. And so it was basically, if you faced it, it was like a wall. So horses didn't really charge it, they couldn't figure it out very well. And so it happened during some battles that the wagons, some of them were destroyed, but usually it was very tough to break it, because you need to understand what people at the time thought about warfare and how they fought. and that was heavy cavalry decided most battles, and they relied on it heavily. Also, heavy cavalry was composed mainly of noblemen, which equipped themselves and had their own retinues of other armored cavalry knights that were with them, that were funded from private coffers of the noble houses. And additionally, with this, you would also have regiments composed of men-at-arms or professional soldiers who would be held by the kingdom as a police force, tax collectors. These would be their decisions and keeping peace. And so these would be the soldiers the Hussites were fighting. Hussites had people with military careers and professions amongst them, but it was also a whole bunch of just peasants and people who didn't really fight anyone ever. And so they kind of had to build themselves up into a combat force over time, and they did it with improvising and making sure that they focused on what worked for them and don't try to fight the enemy in pitched battles, armored cavalry, because they couldn't field it. KCD2 with Hussites confirmed. Maybe. It is kind of approaching that period, so it's not impossible. They already hinted at a bunch of Hussite stuff in KCD1, so, you know, I wouldn't put it past them. Now, as I said, KCD character Capon, Lord Capon was later with the Catholics, so it's another thing. So warfare at this period was decided mostly by heavy cavalry. Armies just charged each other with heavy cavalry. Usually the infantry would play a supporting role. The armor offered a barrack protection, but usually it was such good protection that the nobles were not that afraid for their lives in combat, and it was customary for them to take a lot of prisoners during fighting rather than kill them, so that they can sell them off for ransom, which the Hussites didn't really do much. They just killed them. And they also used a lot of armor-piercing weapons, as I said, and so they adopted early gunpowder. They loved it. They also used a whole bunch of pole arms. I'm gonna show you. This is from a history book here in Czech. It's for educational purposes, but I took some pictures of the illustrations that are in it. And so you've got how could a regular Hussite trooper look like, approximately. And so you've got different weapons, some of them repurposed agricultural implements. So you have this scythe, which usually would be facing this way, but it was straightened up. Oh yeah, I need to go back. Let's play some more Knights and Merchants. So we've got the repurposed implements, which were the poor man's weapon, basically. So you get regular spears and pikes. You also got hooks on sides of some pole arms to throw people off of saddles and just generally immobilize them with that. Down here you can see the smallest diameter hand cannon, which was called pištela, which is supposed to be flute. It's pištela is flute, and so that's how it was called, because it looked like it. If you took a look at the part of a organ, so that would be one of the flutes in it, and so that's how they called it. And that was used against armor, but it needed to be used in close proximity, which was not a problem, since the enemy armies usually just tried to charge and overwhelm the Hussites, because they had overwhelming numbers advantage in vast majority of cases. And so they would come close and receive a face full of grape shot as well from the Hofnitze, as well as just shots from these improvised hand cannons. Then you've got cattle hats, mostly popular with the Hussites because they protect well against overhead swings. And that was the most popular helmet for Hussites, was kettles. Then you've got Pavis shields, so not all of them used it, but it was designated roles to defend the gaps between wagons that used the Pavis shields, and crossbowmen used it as well. If they were on a hilltop that was in the middle of the wagonburg, they would have shooters on top of that hill to shoot, and they would protect themselves with Pavis shields. Now, with the soldier himself, you can notice just general common clothing, leatherworked or cloth trousers and leather boots. You've got regular leather aprons and tabards. Then you've got chainmail, very popular. usually you would have it end somewhere near the hand, so the hands would be a vulnerable spot on a soldier in medieval period a lot of the time, unless it was a fully armored knight, which was even some knights just didn't have a hand protection some of the time, and so you could just chop off someone's hand, and that would pretty much put them out of the fight immediately, even if they had armor everywhere else. You could focus on that part. If you are really good at your weapon, you could do that, or if you are lucky. Underneath the chainmail, you would have gambeson, which is cloth armor, which is layered so that it can have anything between like 10 up to 50 layers of cloth padded, and so you would also have wool in it. And even in summer, you would be wearing this beneath your chainmail and during combat situations. And so the gambeson actually worked quite well. There are historical tests with weapons that are made as replicas of historical weapons and used against gambesons in tests, like cut tests, stab tests, various things, tried to penetrate the armor. And it's shown that it can hold up surprisingly well unless the blade is very sharp and very well made. It will usually not cut through the whole fabric of the gambeson, so you would have to have multiple swings into the same general area for it to really penetrate. Plus you've got some level of protection against arrows, so unless you had battlefield bows, it wouldn't penetrate. So regular hunting bows, or it depends a lot on the arrow as well, but it's shown in some tests shooting the gambeson with arrows that some of the arrows just stick out of it and without penetrating deep enough to inflict any damage. Sometimes it would poke you, but it wouldn't really penetrate any vital organ or anything like that, so it's something to say as well. Okay, so let's take a look at another picture we've got. So we've got weapons of the Hussites, and so you've got a boar spear that was also popular because of the flanks that could be used. I think that's not to get it stuck inside the prey or the target, and so that's against unarmored people, or if you are stabbing like a horse, you know, which happened a lot of the time. A lot of the knights didn't have enough to really armor their horses too well, and so they would have very good armor, but the horses wouldn't be armored completely most of the time. Then you've got sudlice, which is like a cutting pole arm implement. It also had a hook, and so you would use this as well mostly against unarmored targets, but even the bludgeoning force of this hitting you would often, if it hits you straight on the head, it would break your neck, basically, by the sheer blunt force. And if it hit anywhere that was not armored, it would inflict severe damage, of course. It would absolutely like cut off your arm if this hit you without any armor. Then you've got sudlice, which is a different type of this. It could also have a hook, but this is like also a cutting pole arm, so you can see the blade there. Then you've got one-handed weapons. They liked using axes, maces, and warhammers with spikes. This one is a kind of an over-exaggerated one, which is quite fancy, but usually you would have something more crude. But yeah, this could also be an implementation. You have a flat surface to strike and bludgeon armored targets, as well as spike to penetrate, but to penetrate armor, it really required the warhammer to be made of very solid material in order for the hardness of it to actually serve its purpose and penetrate the armor, which was usually very expensive, and people wouldn't use it if it didn't work. And so even with specialized implements, it was always a chance if you kind of penetrate or not. It depends a lot on the hardness of the armor versus hardness of the weapon. And then they also loved to use two-handed flails. That was one of their favorite weapons, because they could be used from the wagons and strike quite far out of them, as well as just while charging with the flanking attacks we showed earlier with the tactics. They used the two-handed flails to great effect. This one is kind of over-exaggerated. I don't think that this is necessarily accurate. The spiked thing is just completely ridiculous. But they did add spikes to it. Historically, we have some examples of that. It's just this bow thing. I don't think it was used all that much. While this actually was, which is croppage, which is a pole arm that's a solid pole, and it has a bunch of spikes, which that could also be used against armored targets, but especially if you are unarmored or against a horse, that would drive it off very well. Now, with something to say about the flails, You see like some of the medieval flails in fantasy using a long chain on one-handed flails. That's not very good. Usually it would present a large threat of hitting yourself or anyone around you that you might not want to hit, which could be pretty bad. And there is a difference. When you mount it on a long pole, there is a significantly less chance of that happening, and then you amplify that force still, and so that's what works. One-handed flails, not so much. So one-handed, you would use mace or a warhammer rather than a flail most of the time. And then swords, but swords are better used against unarmored or lightly armored targets, and so they wouldn't necessarily be of any great use against the armored enemies the Hussites faced. But they did have them as sidearms. They especially liked their falchions, which is one-edged sword, one-handed one usually. Now you can take a look at different kinds of Hussite war wagons, and so you've got your standard war wagon here in the middle, which is a war wagon with flail crew, so they wouldn't have shooters in it. So in this circumstance, they would deploy the Wagenburg along some sort of hill, and then on the hill you would have people with firearms, and then in the front the flail people would be manning the Wagenburg. Of course, you had your puppies in the middle of each, like in between each wagon. Plus, you've got your Hofnice and other various small cannon, like Tarasnice, which is another kind of cannon. Next kind of wagon we have in this picture is this one, which is straight up shooter, or how would you call it? Yeah, shooter wagon, which is just people with firearms and crossbows shooting from arrow slits, and it didn't have flail people in it, and it had the big desk that was covering it. You can see in each of these that they also have these loopholes down here for people in prone position shooting through there, and the wagons would be blocked in place so they cannot be moved. War horses were fucking expensive. Kill the horse in economic pain, yeah, but also just depriving the enemy of mobility and all that logistics, because then if you are a knight, you are probably gonna have a squire and an additional horse and maybe another horse that carries your supplies. But if it happens repeatedly, which during a single battle it could, then you could very well be stuck as an army then, because how are you gonna lug all your shit away if you need to run away? Well, you are not. You are just gonna abandon it, and then the Hussites are gonna loot it. So that's how it works. So yeah. Then you've got combined wagon as well, which is here. Just this one, you've got some flail people as well as shooters, so they would also combine it, and they would add sort of like a picket fence to it. So that's how it would look like. So we've got different kinds of these wagons. It was not one. And then down here you can see an example of the shooter wagon, and so you see the ammunition as well as the stones. And then you've got people with different firearms and crossbows, and as well as a loading bridge from the back, so you can evacuate wounded, you can funnel in more ammunition, or make more men come into the wagon without actually needing to climb over it, because it was quite difficult to do so. And yeah, so that's how the wagons looked like. Do I have anything else I want to show you in terms of... Oh yeah, we can... That is this Falchion is here. So there's this sword right here. This was quite popular against unarmored targets or lightly armored targets. Quite a good cutting force. It's like a machete sort of situation with that's going on. And oh yeah, also on the side, Shidlo, which is a needle in translation basically. And that's this thing, which is just a polearm with very long spike, which is very straight, and it would very easily, you could find gaps in enemy armor and stab through. Especially if the enemy is against a rigid surface, like it's lying on the ground, you can just finish off knights that were knocked off very easily with this. You just stuck it in a slit in the helmet or under the armpit, somewhere where there is a gap in the plate armor, and finish them off with that. So that's what I did. I want to show you the bag. Oh yeah, this is a modern replica reconstruction of the wagon and how it might have looked like. Some people do still make them for various events in terms of like historical reconstructions here. So this is what they made. That is Hofnice. So this is the cannon, and it basically is more like a howitzer or a mortar, I guess you could say, because it loads a different kind of shell depending on what you want to shoot. Solid shot I usually used against packed groups at medium distance. It was not really capable of long ranged fire, and so medium distance was the best you could hope for. So you'd be using this, or you would be using at close distance grape shot, or even like scraps of metal, just jam it down the barrel after you put in the charge, jam it down the barrel and then shoot it like a giant shotgun. So yeah, Hussite's very fond of this thing. This was instrumental in that tactic because it allowed them to dispose of packed armored masses of units. We have an example, yeah, we took a look at that. Anything else? I can show you a bird's eye view of a castle ruin today, which is one of the this was actually a castle where Jan Žižka lost his second eye while besieging it, and so you can see how it was structured. So you've got your donjon, which is the main tower, then you've got your keep, which is this structure, then you've got your internal bailey, which is a place where you have a secondary wall and it cannot be breached if the enemies conquer this. Which there was usually a single best approach point, which is right here, this main path, but the besiegers would also besiege these points, usually. This is a rugged cliff, by the way, over here, that would be impossible to pass. And so the enemies would besiege where possible over here. And then you've got your external bailey, which is the first layer of fortifications, which also had most of your castle structures over here. And so that's how castles were usually structured. There were also a bunch of smaller castles as well, which just had garrisons of like 10 men. A lot of them were in Bohemia, like there are a shit ton of nobles. A lot of them had just a very small castle or holdings. And so the Hussite wars were actually full of very small sieges, where the Hussites would just go around the country besieging all very small towns and castles and even bigger castles, and then looting them. And one of the things they did was they usually, when they bust into a castle or a city, they would just immediately round up all the Catholic priests and burn them alive, and then they would storm and loot and desecrate all the Catholic property, churches, monasteries, you name it. So that was their favorite pastime activity. Right. Where we left off in the script. I have notes, so I just need to take a look. We talked about the history background, so now we get into the actual events. Not going to be popular. Yeah. They also did make excursions into Hungary and German lands during their later period of Hussite wars, because they managed to beat off 4 crusades, and so they had plenty of manpower and willingness to actually go and also do excursions elsewhere, because the land was so devastated that they needed to get supplies elsewhere as well, you know. So that was the thing. Right. So when King heard about the events, he apparently suffered from a stroke, and after 3 weeks he died. Apparently suffered from a stroke. The people at the time didn't know what stroke was, but they described him having an incredible attack of rage that overwhelmed him, and after which he grabbed his chest and screamed, and then after 3 weeks he died. So that's what happened to the king when he heard that the Hussites have thrown all the councillors he just appointed out of the windows and defenestrated them, killed them, and there was a general uprising in Prague. And when he heard this, he had a stroke and died. While this was happening, people were in general uprising in Prague, but some royal troops were still garrisoning parts of the city, like the Prague Castle, Vyšehrad Fortress, as well as just some general parts of the city. And so the Hussites didn't really conquer the city proper. Instead, they just packed up and left. And they continued gathering all the followers along the way. And they established their camp in Tabor, which is this smaller purple circle in the southern Bohemia, which I told you before, where Jan Hus was secluded in a small castle near there before, but they made the new city, which is called Tabor, and Tabor literally means in Czech translation an encampment or camp. So that's what it means, and that's what they found, and that's where they all concentrated the forces and invited all the other Hussites to come there and collaborate and organize themselves into armies, basically. Okay, let's read the script. So when the king died, this has thrown the country into a total anarchy, and Sigismund of Hungary officially inherited all of Wenceslas's titles, but Bohemian nobles sent him a letter of demands that Sigismund could not accept. Basically, they wanted the same thing, like they wanted what Hus wanted, and so Sigismund couldn't really accept that because he was a Holy Roman Emperor and he wouldn't really like reducing the authority of the clergy and couldn't force, even if he wanted to, he wouldn't really do anything. So he just said no. And yeah, Sigismund could not accept that. So Sigismund then went to Vratislav city in Silesia to begin mustering a crusading army against the Hussites. So Vratislav is here. Can we paint? Right here. So Sigismund went to Bratislava to start mustering an army to lead a crusade into Bohemia to crush the revolt. Bohemia was engulfed by revolution and general uprising, while Silesia and Lužice declared their support for the Catholic order. So you've got a situation where all the red border, all the Bohemia was for Hussites, or basically there were some pockets, but that was basically where the revolt was the strongest. Then you've got Silesia, which is orange, which was mainly Catholic, and Lužice is here. And then you had Moravia, which split in between different factions, and so some of them were Hussites, some of them were Catholic. Situation of Moravia was split between factions of nobles declaring for Hussites and the church, and Pope has declared a crusade against the Bohemian uprising. The Hussites then established a city of Tabor, where they appointed 3 governors. One of them was Jan Žižka, who was to become one of the greatest military minds of the period. He remained undefeated until his death. And so we took a look at Žižka before. He was the guy who started out as an impoverished noble. He became a bandit and a mercenary at one point of his life, and then he became a king's guard when he was pardoned for his crimes, and then he became a Hussite leader for the Hussites after they founded the Tabor city, because he was one of the people who actually had quite a bit of military experience. So I'm gonna show you Žižka again. This is approximately how he would look like. So in 1420, near town of Sudomir in Bohemia, Hussite army of 400 infantry, including women and children, 12 wagons and 9 cavalry were commanded by Žižka. They encountered a force of 5,000 Bohemian Catholics, mostly heavy cavalry and nobles. So battle ensued at Sudomir. So it was 400, roughly 400 Hussites. Some of them counted as women and children, which the women usually reloaded weapons or just tended to wound it, maybe threw stones and things like that, while the children were using slings. So everyone was a fighter. So there was 400 people, 12 wagons and 9 cavalry, and they were faced by 5,000 Bohemian Catholics, mostly heavy cavalry. So again, mounted knights, well armored usually, quite a few man-at-arms with them as well, so a lot of people with crossbows and other various kind of weapons like polearms, infantry formations basically. Battle ensued where Hussites formed up the wagons on the edge of dried up lake and let the cavalry charge them repeatedly without success, while inflicting heavy losses. The Catholic forces' casualties were cited as high, while Hussite suffered also high casualties. So we don't have any specific numbers. But considering the Hussites were then able to just pack up and leave the battlefield while the Catholic army was left in total distraught, speaks to Hussite victory, which it was declared their victory, and they were left to just do whatever they wished afterwards, which is quite surprising considering, like, if you just take a look at that in terms of, like, if you play this as a total war battle, you probably wouldn't trust yourself with 400 people against 5,000, especially if they are higher quality units. But this is what happened, and so it's insane. But yeah, they formed up on a dried lake bed at Sudomar village, or near it rather, and then the knights just, due to sheer arrogance, thought that just a bunch of peasants, so we'll just write them down. So they just charged repeatedly over a mudded up, dried lake, which caused the dam to get swamped in the mud quite a bit, like in an Agincourt sort of situation, where they were then pelted from close range with various ranged weapons, as well as counterattacked from the teleports by a lot of flail people. So that really didn't go well for them. They suffered high losses. Hussites also suffered high losses. And the Hussites lost 3 wagons out of 12, and 30 Hussites were captured on top of that. Despite this, it was a resounding success for the movement and attracted many new followers to their cause. Later that year, Sigismund and force of 7,000 to 8,000 crusaders, mainly from Germany, arrived at Prague and besieged it. Defending the siege was again Žižka. Crusaders attempted to capture hilltop of Vítkov, which resulted in a battle that caused around 300 losses, while Hussites also suffered some casualties. Reportedly several dozen men. The Catholic attack was through a narrow path up a hill and was reckless. Many more knights lost their horses or suffered wounds. Some fell into ditches and on cliffs. Hussites counterattacked later in the battle, causing general confusion and routed the Catholics. The battle was still a Hussite victory, as Crusaders were unable to capture the hill to gain access to the city. Sigismund later listened to his Bohemian allies and let them negotiate his coronation, which needed to happen in Kuttenberg, or Kutná Hora, which is, if you take a look at the map, it's close to Prague. It's the second purple circle on the right, which was another royal city. It was quite important, and Sigismund went there for his coronation. It also had a cathedral as Prague, but it was not as prestigious and definitely wasn't a success. He wanted to conquer Prague so that he can become crowned Bohemian king in there to solidify his rule, but that didn't happen. Now, at this point, I'm gonna let you listen to the Hussite anthem. They had their own, they were famous for singing battle chorus while going to fight. And later on, while they defeated several crusades, the fourth one was so terrified of them when they heard it, because it was a huge procession of people. The Hussite armies grew to a quite large extent during the later Hussite war period, because it had the success brewed more success, basically. So if it was crushed immediately, people just wouldn't join it all that willingly, while when they just saw that it was working, more and more people joined it, and so that's how it gained traction. And so the Fourth Crusade arrived with being led by a bishop, as well as just some general commanders from the noble houses. And when their soldiers heard the Hussites approach and they heard the battle chorus, they famously just ran away and abandoned their their baggage train and everything behind, and just left. So that's also quite ridiculous. Like, I couldn't make this up. It's just, some of this stuff is just bonkers. Let's listen to the chorus. I have found a thing that has English subtitles to it, which is important, so you can actually understand the words a bit. But it has some orchestral music behind it, because there is no accurate representation of having it without that today. You can find some examples which don't have it, but this is what's gonna have to suffice. There might be some pictures in the background. No, it's just a thing. So let's listen to it together. Usually I would have people with flutes or other kind of musical instruments playing, but it's not nowhere near like this sort of instrumental background. It's over exaggerated. It just repeats it. There's another part of this song which probably isn't featured, which is calling to individual parts of the army to do certain tasks, but I don't think we have that here. Yeah, of course. No. This is the words are exact. The music behind is of course modern because this was made like for a movie during the Comi times, I think, in terms of the music performance with the chorus. But this was exact words of the chorus that they would sing, and they would have their own musical instruments with them, like flutes and drums and things they would play on. But the words are exact because it was actually kept. Same as the first actual national anthem of Bohemia is also preserved, which is Saint Wenceslaus Chorale, which also is preserved today. But we know all the words that were in there. It's just, it's very hard to find an accurate representation of this song. I even have one that's sung with a modern, like a rock background, and it actually has all the things in it that were in there, because this one is gonna miss some words, which are quite important. But I don't want to have you have the most modern one because that would be ridiculous. This one is the closest I can find to have it, like, just imagine not the orchestral music in the background and you are pretty much spot on. Just imagine flutists or something playing with them instead. So you see, it emphasizes comradeship as well as listening to orders and commanders, and also do not look on the numbers of enemies because they were outnumbered in every single battle. Like you saw the numbers, it was 5,000, 8,000 against like hundreds of people on the other side, on Hussite side, and they still managed to pull it off, and all thanks to the wagon book tactics. If they fought the enemies in a regular one-dimensional battle where they just would approach it the same way as another medieval army, they would get absolutely slaughtered. There would be no chance at all. And so that's why they developed this kind of idea of using the wagon book tactics as their core warfare mechanic, because Žižka came up with it, and it was successful, and this was widely adopted by all the other Hussites, because it was not just Žižka's shik or his formation, but also you had various other Hussite armies that were at this point going about Bohemia and Moravia and sieging castles, sieging cities, doing this thing, and they also equipped their own wagons, made their own armies, and they also developed their sort of different ideologies, like we said. But yeah, it worked surprisingly well. Like, it's insane how well it worked. Repetition. And that's the ending. There is one last part of that song that's missing, but I cannot find it unless we talk about the rock one. I mean, do you want to hear the rock one? I can play it if you want. It just depends on you. I was not sure if you could hold the attention for this long, really, so that's why I skipped through the last part. So I'm gonna leave that up to you. If you want to listen to it, I can find it. It's not a problem to find it. It's just, I'm not gonna be able to find English subtitles for it, so it probably would be kind of useless anyway for you. When was the rock one from? It's quite recent. I can show you the link. It starts with a flute, but later it has rock elements. This is the entire song, like straight up lyrics. No, not of the repeating flair bullshit that the other one had. I could stop and translate if you want, but you need to let me know if you're interested in it. Now you'll get the rock part. And this is the part I was mentioning. He calls different parts of the army. How much of it is taught in schools, what you told us? Maybe even a little bit more. It is a heavy national sort of theme with the Hussites here. And so it depends a lot on the teacher you get, but it has a big slot in learning about medieval history here. But I didn't want to swamp you with all the details, because there is a shit ton of things that were happening at the same time with the Hussite, different sort of lords who adopted it or not, and you know, not necessarily too interesting for the warfare element of it. So yeah, that's just the end of it. It's gonna get quieter and quieter until it dies off. Now, something to note is the Hussites as a faction, when looked back in history, were abused by a lot of people in terms of their ideology. Like, for example, the communists, when they took over, what happened was they weren't fond of Christians. Communists in general are not fond of religions. And so they banned or significantly reduced the influence of every Christian faith order here, but they encouraged Kalishnice, which is the basically Hussites, modern day like Hussite religion, and they did it because of Hussites. How they developed the city of Tabor was, there's a rumor, it's not confirmed, but it's written even on like sources where it's cited, but I couldn't find it everywhere, so I didn't necessarily talk about it. But I will mention it as a general thing that's known, and that is when they established the city of Tabor, they had big tubs of wood in the city square, and they would put their belongings in it because they didn't have that many resources and they needed to pool them together, and they did it willingly according to themselves. And then they pooled them together, all the food, all the things that they could use as a community, and then they lived from it in order to get stronger and organize, and then went out into besieging the castles and everything. And so that's how it was done basically. And that the communists went over and said, oh yeah, that looks like collectivization, right? And so we are gonna say that the Hussites were freaking proto-communists, and that's why they allowed it more than other parts or branches of Christian religion when they took over Czechoslovakia. And so yeah, multiple different people tried to use it for their own ideology. And not only that, but also in modern day Czechia, the Kdo jsou boží bojovníci History channel, partially it's just a history special We have that once a month, or at least that's the plan. In modern day Czechia, you have the Hussite Kdo su boží bojovníci song as an anthem for all the military forces. That's what plays when you get as a recruit and you have your oath of loyalty. You have this being played by the band of the Prague Castle Guards, and you also have it as a general anthem for all the military and police forces here. And so it's still retained as a heavy symbolism. The first Czech legions that were formed during First World War. Looks great. Yeah, try my best, but it's kind of rudimentary still. What do I want to say? Oh yeah, when first Czechoslovak legions formed during World War I, they also adopted the chalice as some of their flags, because they also saw Hussites as their inspiration. And so with this in mind, even today, some military units have chalice as their coat of arms, basically, or how do you call it? As insignia of their unit, or part of that military branch. And so you also have military, when you have epaulets for military officers, and you've got different markings. So when you have someone being an officer, they have crossed maces that are here, because mace was a main weapon that was used by Žižka. It was his favorite weapon, because he would point with it like to point at different parts of the battlefield to command his troops. And so mace has become a signifying rank of an officer here. In GDR, the Hussites were also popular with communists. I remember having book skits from GDR times about the Hussites. Yeah, it spread, of course. I believe it was throughout, like, Soviet satellite states. They for sure shared this, because they found Hussites when they got hold of Czechoslovakia. They found this and they're like, oh, this is a propaganda thing, like crazy. It's just basically made for us. We don't have to come up with anything. Well, it's still misguided to think they were communists, but to an extent it was a rebellion against the standing system, and there was a level of shared resources pulled together, but it was not collectivization. Like, it's misguided to think about it as such, but it's just, as an example, people used it for their agenda, not necessarily for what it really was. And so just keep that in mind. If you read about it or hear about it somewhere, it might not necessarily be reflective of the reality. And so let's take a look at the script again. So I've got something more to say, right? Where we left off last time. Oh yeah, Battle of Vítkov. So the Crusaders were unable to gain access to the city, and Sigismund later listened to his Bohemian allies and let them negotiate his coronation, which happened in Kuttenberg, as we said, and then as a king of Bohemia. So on 28th of July 1420, Sigismund of Hungary was coronated in the St. Vitus Cathedral in Prague, since it was not held by the Hussites at the time. And afterwards, he retreated to the Catholic city of Kuttenberg. Okay, so that's how it was, sorry. So, coronated in Prague because Prague castle was still held by the royal garrison. Then he went to Kuttenberg because he needed to disband the army. He couldn't keep the supply up and he lost a battle. In Eastern Germany, books and links to Czech literature were strong in general. I also remember that ant with the red scarf, well, socialistic, heroic. Oh yeah, Ferdinand Mravenec. It's quite popular even to this day, like a children's fairy tale, basically. No, Kuttenberg, Kutná Hora, because Kutná is mining and Hora is mountain. But it is generally known as that, so I called it that. But it's Kutná Hora in Czech, but you wouldn't be able to really, identify it. So that's why I called it that. Afterwards he retreated to the Catholic city of Kuttenberg, where Sigismund disbanded the Crusader army as it struggled to maintain supply, and there were issues with many different Crusader groups along national lines, because the Crusader army was part Silesian, part German, part Austrian, and some Moravian and Czech Crusaders were in it as well. And so what happened with that, they suffered a crushing defeat. They went on to coronate the king, and then the supply was low, so morale disintegrated. And so instead of trying to keep that up expensively with a lot of money, he just said, okay, fuck it, just go home. And so that's what happened. He just disbanded the army of the First Crusade. Hey Florence, welcome. So let's continue. Where is this? I'm getting lost in my script, I'm sorry for that. Oh yeah, so in 1421, Catholic garrisons in Prague Castle and Vyšehrad Fort surrendered to the Hussites. So that was the last places in Prague that were held by the royalists, which surrendered, were starved out basically. In the same year, Bohemian nobles opposed to Sigismund held a summit in Čáslav city where they decided to declare Sigismund an enemy of the people and the crown. They also sent offers of Bohemian crown to the Polish king. So they wanted Polish Jagiellon dynasty to send someone to become a Bohemian king, and they would rather have that than Sigismund. And they also declared Sigismund an rightful king and tyrant and enemy of the people, basically. That's what they did. Towards the end of 1421, the Hussites consolidated power as there were many different factions, some of them more radical than others. During this time, there was a second crusade, which also ended in failure, while besieging a city of Žatec that was well supplied. Due to poor leadership and multiple failed assaults, the Crusaders eventually retreated and disbanded after their camp was set aflame and rumors of Hussite army nearby spread through their ranks. So they besieged the city of Čáslav, which is here, nearby Kuttenberg. And what happened with that is they besieged it, they tried their regular tactics of just mashing armored people against it. They didn't work, they suffered casualties, then their camp was set aflame, which burned a bunch of their supplies and caused further losses. And then they also heard a rumor that a huge Hussite army was nearby, so they just disbanded the army completely. So that was the Second Crusade. And in early 1422, the Catholic forces managed to gain some minor victories and forced some Moravian nobles to sign alliance with Sigismund. However, later that year, the Hussites defeated the Catholics twice, which led to their retreat from Bohemia back into Moravia. So the Catholics managed to persuade or force nobles in Moravia to more or less sign with the Catholics at this point, and then they tried to invade Bohemia again but failed and had to retreat because they were beaten in several battles. Žižka lost his second eye through crossbow bolt during a siege of Ráby Castle, but continued to lead the army after his recovery. On the 11th of October 1422, Jan Žižka died of plague during a siege of Přibyslav Castle. After his death, the Hussite leadership struggled to find a proper replacement. They did, but it was nowhere near as a good commander as Žižka was, and in terms of even ideologically speaking, the Hussites, which were previously commanded by Žižka, started to call themselves orphans, because they felt like they were orphaned by Žižka dying, and they didn't trust the other Hussite high leaders because they felt like the nobles were trying to follow their own power struggles rather than serving the cause in general, while Žižka was purely devoted to the cause of the Hussite movement. Overall, After this period, there was a schism amongst the Hussites, where they fought each other for supremacy. They still managed to defeat two more Crusader armies, as usual better equipped with lots of heavy cavalry. The Fourth Crusade army fled only after hearing the Hussite battle chorus. The Hussite wars finally concluded in 1434 at the Battle of Lipany, where Catholic army, along with Hussite Ultraquist forces, which was the separatists from the main Hussite faction, the more moderate Hussites were called Ultraquists, and they joined forces with Catholics and defeated the radical Hussites at the Battle of Lipany. So it was Wagenburg against Wagenburg in that battle, which is quite insane. But it was decided a lot by artillery and then charges. numbers, basically. I wonder why Sigismund didn't bring his Hungarian army in. They should have dealt better with the Hussites with their higher mobility. Problem was, they had cavalry, like even the regular crusaders had it, and also money. Sigismund could call on people to come on a crusade, and they would, because they would be promised absolution from their sins if they participate. But if he was to just go into Hungary and say, I'm your king, you come here and fight for me now, well, guess what? It's a huge campaign, it's costly. So he didn't have the means to fund it. And so he didn't feel like that would help him much. And due to how powerful the Hussites were in the field, even beating much better armies from Germany, he felt like the Hungarians wouldn't be able to do it. So instead, what he did is he tried to focus politically on pulling the strings to defeat the Hussites, which actually worked by splitting them into different factions and buying off one of the factions to fight against the other. And that's why they won, basically. So it was not stupid, it's just, you know, the Hungarians probably wouldn't make that much of a difference and it would be a huge money pit. Overall, the Hussite movement in some regards did achieve its goals. The moderates were distraught after the Battle of Lipany and were unable to continue to oppose the Catholics, but order in Bohemia was restored and Hussites were allowed to practice their religion along with Catholics, which was a unique thing amongst European kingdoms. In practice, Pope and other entities constantly tried to fray at the edges of this agreement, and Hussites were banned from achieving some of the highest ranks and offices. Hussite movement was only completely banned after Battle of Bila Hora, after which the Hussites were forced to adopt Catholic faith. So, 200 years after this, there was another huge battle which decided fate of Bohemia, where the Austrian House of Habsburg gained control over it, and they banned Hussites altogether and made it so that they had to convert into Catholic faith. But after the Hussite Wars, there was a period when Hussites and Catholics were allowed to practice faith, both of them in the same country, which was something unique for the time and it was not common in Europe. So, and now let's list some controversies. So, during the period, our armies in the field relied on plunder to maintain supply. Bohemia and Moravia were full of cities and small and large castles belonging to different nobles. Therefore, the warfare during Hussite Wars was heavily characterized by sieges and siege warfare. After winning a siege, Hussite troops would often desecrate, loot and damage church property, as well as execute Catholic priests by burning them alive. Especially during later years in the war, the land was utterly devastated and devoid of supplies and manpower. Hussites also did various excursions into neighboring lands, for example modern-day Slovakia, and also Hungary and Germany, where they looted supplies and tried to convince local peasants to rise up. Forced conversion, yeah. Well, that's it for the script I have, and we took a look at all the pictures I've managed to get for you. So now we are gonna just answer any questions, if you have any. I'm gonna take a look if I have something else I didn't show you yet, but it's probably not anything too important. What did or do the people in Moravia and Slezsko think of Hussites? As I said, Moravia was a special cookie because it was basically split, not along the geographical lines, but some people were Hussites, some people were Catholics, and they fought each other consistently until the Crusaders mounted a crusade in here and pacified it for Catholics. That's what happened. And so they were sympathetic, some of them, but not all of them, but very happy people. Well, they were quite cheerful. They enjoyed life as anyone else. They did have their goals, which not all of them were achieved, and due to how early the Hussite ideology sprang up, it just wasn't successful. If it happened 100 years later, it would be met with more acceptance and understanding. But unfortunately, that was just not the case. So too early, but even their combat system, like, it was revolutionary, and it did help to put the heavy cavalry tactics into the grave, basically, because the Crusaders started to realize that it just wouldn't work against every single army to just throw heavy cavalry at it and see what happens. Very helpful presentation, insightful presentation. Okay, thanks, Frankie. Appreciate that. You enjoyed it? How has this time been used in popular culture, like games, films, TV? Recently there has been an indie game with Hussites in mind, and it's an RPG, which is apparently not bad. I want to try it myself at some point. It's like top-down perspective. I can maybe find it for you if you want. Can maybe find it. Shadows over Silesia. That's how it's called. And it's apparently 85% ranked in the Czech Gaming Review magazine. You forgot Hussites. Yeah, I mean, multiple games have them as a strap-on feature, but mainly designed about Hussites as a core mechanic. Not many games have that. KCD has them mentioned. You've got TV. Communists made a bunch of old movies about the Hussites. I can show you the Battle of Sudomir, for example. They made a good job at making the armor and everything look well. So at least it should be. Yeah, that's Žižka. It was supposed to be him, can see the mace. And then they also had priests, like they were freaking like if you think about Warhammer Fantasy, they have freaking battle priests. They often had priests charge into combat along with troops on the front line if they did counterattacks. So this is 8 minutes long, and it is the Battle of Sudomir, which was the first one where it's 5,000 Crusaders, heavy cavalry against 400 Hussites and 12 wagons. Back when I drew lines out of things on my channel, I used to program Ping. Which program are you using to draw? MS Paint! And it works. That's the main important thing. I have other programs, but none of them have all the stuff I want and easy to work with, you know? No, I think it's Painting 3D is the application I'm using. It's not the regular Paint. That is awful. Yeah, if it works. I mean, better something that works rather than something that's just, you know, has a bunch of flair, but you have to go into all sorts of different places to look for basic features. I'm not a fan of that. It's just marching. I'm gonna shift. So that's the dried up lake, and they found a high ground position as well. So he surveyed the battlefield. There's actually a rumor about Žižka. When he lost his second eye, he still commanded troops, that's known, but the rumor is he had lieutenants who would be listening to his orders, and they would also be saying, how does the battlefield look like, what's where, how many troops are where, and he would interpret it visually in his mind and delegate orders for them to implement it on the battlefield. And Žižka was undefeated, even in his state of not having any eye left. So that was quite impressive. But this is the old communist movie, so you know it was made with some agenda in mind, but the battle scene was pretty well done. You'll see, especially the Crusader army is quite well flared. How does all of this tie with the Bohemian faction Age of Empires 2? Loosely. I mean, they made the stuff like Hofnitze, which is their unique bombard cannon. They have a Hussite wagon. They have early access to hand cannoneers. So these small things, yes, they have that. But overall, it's not like you shouldn't rely on it as a source, you know? But it's just, it should be obvious at this point. But it's good, it has the faction, it brings more attention to this because it's really interesting. Sigismund is quite a German name. Was he a Bohemian himself? Yes. He was son of Charles IV, which was Bohemian king and German emperor, and he had two sons. He had Václav or Wenceslaus and Sigismund. And so since Bohemia was part of the Holy Roman Empire at the time, German names were quite popular as well. So that's why Sigismund was Sigismund. And they were both his sons, and so that's why he inherited the titles after Wenceslaus died. So they set up the Wagenburg. Some Pavis, yeah, they actually did do their research. Like, they're putting the stuff in correct places, which is impressive. But way too few people on the wagons. And so all of them look like flail wagons. None of them have the embrasure. There you go, the cavalry. And all of this had to be done in real life, like no CGI at that time, right? So keep that in mind. Kids as slingers, and you have the shooters on the hilltop with crossbows, hand cannoneers in the wagons and between them, plus cannons. Then you have flail people in reserve to do flanking attack. All of that checks out so far. And they only had 9 horsemen, so that also checks out. You don't see many cavalry. So they're just talking about what the tactic is gonna be. The Crusaders are just gonna recklessly charge them down. They think that they have a massive advantage. We did 5,000 against 400 is quite substantial advantage. I think you should agree with that, especially if you are considering they had much better equipment and training. And reinforcements of theirs arrived, I guess. Or are they just going? Yeah, they're going in, I think. Is this gonna be disappointing and no battle? Oh yeah, we have a second episode of that. Fine, let's watch it. Let it happen. Yeah, they're coming. It's quite disorganized cavalry charge, but yeah. Still, the amount of costumes and everything that had to be made is impressive for the movie. I have to give them that. Waiting for them to be close to fire. because otherwise the weapons would have limited effect. The horses were quite spooked by all the fire from the firearms, as well as just general hailstorm of crossbow bolts and stone sling. Flails. Like, one way to defeat the Wagenburg would be, like, if you think about it, just make your own artillery, bring it, just besiege them, you know? That would work. It's just they didn't have it. There's a whole bunch of heavy cavalry because they chased them, so they managed to catch up. They didn't really have even many infantry. They had some men-at-arms, but not an overwhelming amount. But most of these were knights and nobles, so... Fire probably be effective too. Yeah, for sure. If you could set fire to that. But getting close to it without getting shot in the face was probably a feat. Just a freaking turkey shoot. This is dramatic being hit action. Do you mean you don't react like that when something falls on her head? Just like, hey! And get carried off by a whole bunch of your servants? I do that all the time. Totally innocuous human behavior. No, of course, it was, some of the stuff is quite silly. But still, like, the amount of costumes is something I have to compliment, for sure. Don't hurt the horses. Well, that's just the way of the battle. There's no way not to hurt the horses. Constantly landing arrows on them, yeah, that would work as well. Just outshooting them was a problem, since they just brought a whole bunch of heavy cavalry, because that's what that was what worked, you know? For most enemies. Just bogged down in mud, they try to advance on foot as well, because the mud blocked the horse movement quite a bit. But heavy armor is just horrible at fighting in mud. And so the lightly armored Hussites were able to counterattack that quite well. They're really bad at learning. Yeah, probably. But you know, it's what worked for most battles, and so they were like, yes, this must work. And it also didn't help that a whole bunch of the commanders died when they fought the battle, or were just not appointed again if they lost. And so a new guy came in and just like, this is gonna work, this worked every time when I was fighting, so it's gonna be fine. It's insane this rebellion worked. It's like you wouldn't think it would work, you know? But it did. But stepping through plate mail with a sword is a feat. Some drama. And yeah, communists love to portray the Hussites as just absolute rabble. But they did have a lot of gambesons and all that, it just they didn't show that because peasant is the best, you know? But yeah, this is quite well done, I think. Just absolute massacre. I guess motivation was high on the Hussite side since they defended their home territory. Yeah, for sure. It was a key part of that as well. But you know, they did try a lot to beat them. It's just they weren't able to quickly, and so it was causing more and more distress. Also, removing that quarrel was a horrible idea because now she bleeds out. That's not what you should do, man. But whatever. Yeah. They also have a Battle of Wheatkov if you want to watch that, but I think that's enough. This is one of the movies that was made since you asked about it. Bad time to be a whore. Yeah, quite. So, anyways, that's gonna be it for the Hussite Wars from me. So I hope you enjoyed it. This is also a longer episode than we've done in the past, 2 hours almost. I hope it wasn't boring. I tried my best to compile all the information into something that's understandable as well as enjoyable to learn about, and not just a whole bunch of names and dates, because that's what it is if you look it up, especially on Czech Wiki. There are a lot of good sources that they mention there, and there is a whole bunch of information which just isn't that good for someone who's just learning the basics about this. And so I just excluded a whole bunch of stuff. So if you want, you can look it up and read more about it. There's always more to learn about it. But in core, this is what I came up with. So again, I hope it was enjoyable, and it was at least a little fun to watch it. And I will be sharing it in the exclusive category of Discord for anyone if they want to download the pictures and script. They can have that for themselves. So anyways, that's gonna be it from me for now. So thanks for watching and see you around. Bye.